But how do you feel about Margaret Atwood writing a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale? Hey everyone, how's it going? So the big exciting book news this week is that Margaret Atwood and her publisher announced that she will be publishing her sequel to The Handmaid's Tale called The Testaments. It'll be out in September 2019, and we know very little about it except what Margaret Atwood tweeted, that it'll take place 15 years after Offred's final scene, and it'll be narrated by 3 female characters. And so the reactions to this news have been very mixed. Some people who are big fans of the book were so excited to hear that there's going to be more of this story. And other people who are big fans of the book were very disappointed and upset that the story is going to be dragged out longer and might be tarnish the original text by continuing her story. And some people feel that Margaret Atwood is just doing this for the money, that obviously she must have been offered a lot of money to write a sequel to the book that has become increasingly popular over the past several years. It feels that way, doesn't it? That in the past several years, its popularity has just like surged way up again. And of course, there was the TV series that came out in 2017, which brought the novel back to the public consciousness again. But it was first published in 1985, which is quite a long time ago. And its sort of popularity has gone up and down over the years, although obviously it's been cemented as sort of a classic text now because it's been being taught in academia and seen as this great example of critiquing the patriarchy of society. But then other people have met the news of this sequel with some hostility, because especially amongst the Can Lit scene, there's heavy critiques of Margaret Atwood herself, and I'm not going to go into those at all because I don't really understand that argument. I don't know what's happened there. If anyone wants to explain to me or enlighten me in the comments below why some people are very angry at Margaret Atwood, then I'd really like to understand why that happened. But my initial sort of reaction to that sort of train of thought is that Margaret Atwood is, on the whole, quite a liberal, good person. It seems that she supports a lot of charitable causes to do with the environment and to supporting young writers and the literary community. And so, yes, she might have said or done some questionable or even wrong things, and but you know, she's just an individual. Like all people are complicated people. I feel like this is a recurring thing in our modern times, that will like come down so hard on certain public figures because of something they said or did, and see that instance as a way of completely dismissing everything that they've done in their life, which obviously feels a bit short-sighted. And you know, there's a big whole argument of looking at the text apart from the author themselves, and so this is a big complicated business. And I know, you know, that's not to like dismiss or excuse anything that Margaret Atwood or anybody else does. That obviously if I personally experienced or saw an instance of her doing something really wrong or saying something really wrong, then I would probably be quite offended too, and I might decide, you know, I'm just not gonna read her books anymore, and that would be fine. But it's interesting how there's this marked difference between how people feel about Margaret Atwood in her native Canada and how the international community view her, which quite often is almost like sort of this great literary goddess, which I don't know if I would put her on that scale of, or anybody on that scale of sort of deification. But anyway, I'm getting off topic, which is that there is going to be a sequel, and how do I feel about this, and how do we all feel about there being a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale? And my initial reaction is sort of like wow, I think that's really interesting, and I'll be eager to read it and see what the sequel is, because I feel like Margaret Atwood is an author that can be sort of trusted with this. I mean, obviously she wrote the Maddaddam trilogy before, which admittedly I only read Oryx and Crake from that trilogy, so I'm not the best authority on her abilities to write sequels and continue characters over multiple books. But yeah, I generally feel quite positively towards sequels, because another example of author who I absolutely love and who wrote a sequel was Elizabeth Strout, who came out with the novel My Name is Lucy Barton, and then a couple years later published a book. It's called a novel, but it's more like a book of short stories called Anything is Possible. And this continues on with the character of Lucy Barton, looking at her from the perspective of lots of other peripheral characters that were referenced in the first book, but not directly shown. And I was skeptical about this at first, because I really liked the first book, Lucy Barton, and then but then I read Anything is Possible, and it gave such an interesting perspective on both like the original novel as well as being a great book in itself. Like, I think you can read Anything is Possible totally by itself, and it's such a great book. So she's such an insightful, beautiful writer, and so yeah, I think that if a sequel can give another perspective on the original text, then it's sort of worth doing that. Just because it's, you know, almost like in a reading club way, you're given all these different perspectives on a book, and it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about it in that way before. And obviously there's multiple ways you can read a book, but sometimes we'll read a novel, especially I think, you know, a like so-called classic novel, and we'll sort of cement how we read that book and think that's the definitive way to understand that novel, when really there's so many different ways you can interpret a novel. And so, you know, and I think like when a novel is interpreted in different mediums, it does this same thing. So like with the recent TV series of The Handmaid's Tale, and how there was a film in 1990 that was out of The Handmaid's Tale, which I've never seen, but which was, the screenplay was written by Harold Pinter, which is super interesting, although apparently he was so dissatisfied with the text, he wanted his name taken off the credits when the film actually came out. And I think critics' reactions to it were quite mixed. They thought stylistically it was sort of interesting, but didn't know what the movie was trying to say. And the book was also made into an opera in the year 2000, which was really interesting. And you know, and several years ago, I saw a production of a few different Virginia Woolf novels, which was made into a ballet, which was super interesting as well. And so yeah, and I think just the seeing these different mediums, it gives us, yeah, a different way of looking at the original text, because obviously it has its own interpretation of what that book was. And so yeah, I'm generally pretty favorable to it, and I think we tend to think that it's a trend in recent decades that sequels are being written of texts and as just a way of sort of cashing in, but this has been something which has occurred throughout the history of literature. I mean, you look way back to when Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe in 1719, I think that was first published, and he wrote multiple sequels to that book as well, and because it was hugely popular, and obviously he wanted to capitalize on it, but and so there's always that tension, though, because it's like, well, is the author just trying to make more money off from something which became hugely popular, which they didn't necessarily, you know, nobody can guarantee how a book is going to perform, and or is it like a genuine artistic enterprise that they think that they have something more to say from what was said in the original book, and so obviously that's up to debate and will be, seen when the Testaments comes out later next year. But I sort of trust that Margaret Atwood, wouldn't. I assume she's comfortably well off now that her books are so popular. So wouldn't be so needing just to do it for the money, that she genuinely has something she wants to say, and thinks that it will be interesting to do it through the lens of continuing this story of Offred, or the sort of fictional worlds that she created in The Handmaid's Tale. And obviously with politics in the recent years, where there is so much more to say about the way the patriarchy controls and influences our society, and famously she's talked about multiple times in The Handmaid's Tale how even though it's considered a sort of dystopian fictional worlds, that there's nothing in the novel which hasn't actually happened in reality itself, in our actual world and in different societies. And and I think that there is a reason why it's still so hugely popular and why people are so inspired by it, because, just in recent years, with protests against Brent Kavanaugh's hearing, when women came to that hearing dressed as handmaids from the Handmaid's Tale, and also when Mike Pence came to visit a certain city, women came out in protest, and wearing the famous red garb and white cowl helmet. And this has occurred many times and is a really potent symbol and way of making a silent protest. That this is an example where there's misogyny at work, where women are really being devalued and not being listened to in the way that they should. And I think that's a really powerful thing. But then, of course, this famous red garb, it's been misinterpreted or used in other ways as well. Like, there's a famous example of how it was made into a sexy Halloween costume, which is ridiculous and awful and so offensive and just so laughable. But this is what happens when a book becomes hugely popular, and which influences the larger culture. And so yeah, I think I'm excited and interested to see what the sequel will bring. Though I don't have the biggest of expectations. I'm aware that it could be a failure, especially because it's quite alarming that Margaret Atwood says in her tweet about this that she's still writing the book. So is this, like my friend Naomi said, is this a first draft or the 9th draft? If this is still the first draft of this novel, then even for a writer of Margaret Atwood's stature, and who's such a seasoned and professional writer, that's a huge weight on your shoulders to still be writing this sequel and have the expectation of the world watching, waiting for this sequel to come out, and who are going to be incredibly critical of it and looking at it, really with a fine-tooth comb, in the way that they wouldn't have if even a famous author came out with a new novel. They wouldn't be looking at it with such a degree of scrutiny. So I think that's a huge amount of pressure and could be a bit dangerous. And if I was Margaret Atwood's editor, I would be terrified. Just the expectation of this is huge, and if the novel isn't really coming off that well, it's like, well, you still have to put it out because you've announced it. So that's a lot of pressure. But yeah, it'll remain to be seen when it comes out next year. But let me know what you think. Are you excited about it? Are you worried about it? Have you already decided you're not going to read it? Or do you feel that, I've seen other people's reactions who feel that The Handmaid's Tale isn't even necessarily Margaret Atwood's best book, and would rather see her focus on other books or new books. So yeah, there's been so many different reactions. I just think it's really interesting and fun to chat about and talk about, and how you feel about literary sequels in general. Is it a good thing or not? And of course, it also has to be noted that another great sequel that's coming out next year, or potential great sequel that's coming out next year is, again, Elizabeth Strout is writing a sequel to her probably her most well-known novel now, Olive Kitteridge, called Olive Again, and that's another book that, you know, we're gonna have to like nervously and wait see how it comes out. But like I said, it's, you know, I feel like I can trust her now because of the sequel to Lucy Barton. So so yeah, 2019. I guess it's gonna be the year of the literary sequels. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye everyone.